It all started innocently enough. I was a senior in high school, 18 years old, and convinced I had my entire life figured out. I was a straight A student, captain of the debate team, and had already been accepted into my dream college. But life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them, and mine came in the form of Mr. Daniels. Mr. Daniels was my English teacher. He was in his early 30s with dark, tousled hair that always looked like he'd just run his fingers through it, and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through you. He had this effortless charm, the kind that made everyone, students and faculty alike, gravitate toward him. He was the kind of teacher who could make Shakespeare sound like a rock star and turn a boring lecture on grammar into something you actually looked forward to. At first, I didn't think much of him beyond the fact that he was a great teacher. But then something shifted. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance here, a casual touch on the shoulder there. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down, I knew there was something more, something dangerous. It started one afternoon after class. I had stayed behind to ask him about an assignment, and as I stood there, nervously fidgeting with the strap of my backpack, I noticed the way his eyes lingered on me. Not in a creepy way, but in a way that made my stomach flutter. He leaned back in his chair, his shirt stretching slightly across his chest, and gave me a small, knowing smile. "You're one of my brightest students, you know that?" he said, his voice low and smooth. I felt my cheeks flush. "Thanks," I mumbled, suddenly unable to meet his gaze. He chuckled softly, and the sound sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't have to be so modest. You've got a gift, Emily. Don't be afraid to own it." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and quickly gathered my things. But as I walked out of the classroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between us. Something I couldn't quite put into words. Over the next few weeks, the tension between us grew. It was in the way he looked at me during class, the way his hand would brush against mine when he handed back my papers, the way he always seemed to find an excuse to keep me after class. I told myself it was all in my head, that I was just imagining things. But then, one day, he crossed a line. It was a Friday afternoon, and the school was nearly empty. I had stayed late to work on a project in the library, and as I was packing up my things, Mr. Daniels appeared in the doorway. He was wearing a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his tie was slightly loosened, like he'd had a long day. He looked different, more relaxed, more approachable. "Emily," he said, his voice soft but commanding, "do you have a minute?" I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, and suddenly the air felt thicker, heavier. He walked over to where I was sitting and leaned against the edge of the table, his eyes never leaving mine. "I've been wanting to talk to you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about something important." I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "What is it?" He hesitated for a moment, as if he was weighing his words carefully. Then he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from my face. His touch was electric, sending a jolt of heat through my body. "You're special, Emily," he said, his voice low and intimate. "I've never had a student like you before. You're different." I felt my breath catch in my throat. This was wrong, so wrong, but I couldn't bring myself to pull away. There was something about the way he was looking at me, the way his voice wrapped around me like a warm blanket that made me feel alive. "Mr. Daniels," I started, but he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Call me Alex," he said, his eyes darkening with something I couldn't quite place. "When it's just the two of us, you can call me Alex." I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing, torn between the voice of reason screaming at me to run and the part of me that wanted to see where this was going. Before I could make a decision, he leaned in closer, his breath warm against my skin. "I know this is unconventional," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I can't stop thinking about you, about us." I felt my heart skip a beat. Us? I repeated, my voice trembling. He nodded, his eyes searching mine for something. Approval, maybe? Understanding? I know it's risky, he said, but sometimes you have to take risks for the things that matter. I didn't know what to say. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: fear, excitement, guilt, desire. I knew this was wrong, that it could ruin both of our lives if anyone found out. But at the same time, I couldn't deny the pull I felt toward him. It was like a magnet, drawing me in, making it impossible to think clearly. Before I could respond, he closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, but quickly deepened into something more. It was wrong, so wrong, but in that moment, I didn't care. All I cared about was the way he made me feel: alive, desired, wanted. When he finally pulled away, I was breathless, my heart pounding in my chest. He looked at me, his eyes dark with desire, and I knew there was no going back. We had crossed a line, and there was no way to uncross it. "This stays between us," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "No one can know." I nodded, my mind still reeling from what had just happened. "I won't tell anyone," I whispered. He smiled, a slow, satisfied smile that made my stomach flip. "Good," he said, "because this is just the beginning, Emily. You and me, we're going to be something special." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I didn't know what I had just gotten myself into, but one thing was certain: my life was never going to be the same. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Every time I walked into Mr. Alex's classroom, my heart would race and my palms would sweat. It was like we were sharing a secret that no one else could see, a secret that made every glance, every word, every touch between us feel charged with electricity. At first, it was just small things: a lingering look across the room, a brush of his hand against mine when he passed me a book, a whispered comment that only I could hear. But soon, those small things turned into something more, something dangerous. It started with notes. He would slip them into my bag when no one was looking, little pieces of paper with words that made my heart skip a beat. "Meet me after class. You looked beautiful today. I can't stop thinking about you." Each note was like a spark, igniting something inside me that I didn't even know existed. Then came the meetings. At first, they were innocent enough, staying after class to discuss an assignment, running into him in the hallway during lunch. But soon, those meetings became something else entirely. He would find excuses to keep me late, to get me alone in his classroom or the empty library. And when we were alone, the tension between us was unbearable. One afternoon, after everyone else had left for the day, he asked me to stay behind to help him grade papers. I knew it was just an excuse, but I didn't care. I wanted to be near him, to feel the way he made me feel. We sat at his desk, our shoulders brushing as we worked, and I could feel the heat radiating off him. It was intoxicating. "You're doing great," he said, his voice low and smooth, "but you're distracting me." I looked up at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "How am I distracting you?" He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made my stomach flip. "You know exactly how," he said, his eyes darkening with desire. Before I could respond, he leaned in and kissed me, his lips soft but insistent. It was different from the first time, more urgent, more desperate. I could feel the hunger in him, the need that matched my own. And in that moment, I didn't care about the consequences. All I cared about was him. From that day on, our meetings became more frequent, more intense. We would steal moments wherever we could, in his classroom, in the empty auditorium, even in his car after school. It was reckless, dangerous, and completely exhilarating. I had never felt so alive, so wanted, so seen. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I knew what we were doing was wrong. He was my teacher, for God's sake. If anyone found out, it would ruin both of our lives. But every time I tried to pull away, he would pull me back in with his words, his touch, his presence. He made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered, and I couldn't resist him. One night, after a particularly intense meeting in his car, I finally worked up the courage to ask him the question that had been weighing on my mind. "What are we doing, Alex?" I asked, my voice trembling. This can't go on forever." He looked at me, his eyes soft but serious. "I know," he said, "but I can't help the way I feel about you, Emily. You're everything to me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but they also scared me. "But what happens when someone finds out?" I asked. "What happens to us then?" He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "No one's going to find out," he said. "We're careful, and besides, you'll be graduating soon. Once you're out of school, we won't have to hide anymore." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. There were too many risks, too many ways this could go wrong. But every time I tried to pull away, he would pull me back in, and I would forget all about the consequences. One day, after school, he took me to his apartment. It was the first time we had been alone together outside of school, and the air between us was thick with tension. He led me to the couch, his hand warm on the small of my back, and we sat down together, our bodies pressed close. "I've been wanting to do this for so long," he said, his voice low and husky. "Just be with you, without having to worry about anyone else." I felt my heart skip a beat. "Me too," I whispered. He leaned in and kissed me, his lips soft but insistent. It was different from the other times, more intimate, more intense. I could feel the heat radiating off him, and it made my head spin. Before I knew it, we were lying down on the couch, his body pressed against mine, his hands exploring every inch of me. It was the first time we had gone that far, and it was everything I had imagined and more. He was gentle but passionate, his touch sending shivers down my spine. But even as I lost myself in the moment, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were playing with fire. Afterward, as we lay there together, his arms wrapped around me, I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. "Alex," I said, my voice trembling, "what are we doing? This can't be right." He looked at me, his eyes soft but serious. "It feels right to me," he said. "Doesn't it feel right to you?" I hesitated, torn between the voice of reason screaming at me to stop and the part of me that wanted to keep going. "I don't know," I whispered. I don't want to get hurt." He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair away from my face. "You won't get hurt," he said. "I promise. I'll never let anything happen to you." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But deep down, I knew that no matter how much he promised, there was no way to protect ourselves from the consequences of what we were doing. We were playing a dangerous game, and sooner or later, it was going to catch up to us. The guilt and fear that had been gnawing at me for weeks finally came to a head one afternoon in late spring. The school year was winding down, and graduation was just around the corner. I should have been excited, looking forward to the future, but instead, I was consumed by dread. The secret I had been carrying was becoming too heavy to bear. It all started with a text. I was sitting in the cafeteria picking at my lunch when my phone buzzed. It was Alex. "Meet me in my classroom after school. We need to talk." My stomach dropped. The tone of the message was different, serious, almost urgent. I spent the rest of the day in a fog, my mind racing with possibilities. Had someone found out? Was this the end? When the final bell rang, I made my way to his classroom, my heart pounding in my chest. He was sitting at his desk, his face pale and drawn. He looked up as I walked in, and the expression in his eyes made my stomach twist. "Close the door," he said, his voice tight. I did as he asked, my hands trembling. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a deep breath, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. "Someone knows," he said, his voice low and strained. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "What do you mean, someone knows?" I asked, my voice shaking. He looked at me, his eyes filled with fear and regret. "One of the other teachers saw us," he said, "last week when we were in my car. She didn't say anything at the time, but she went to the principal this morning." I felt like I was going to be sick. "What did she say?" I asked, my voice trembling. He shook his head, his face pale. "She didn't give specifics, but she said she had concerns about my behavior. The principal called me in for a meeting. They're going to investigate." I felt my heart drop. This was it. This was the moment I had been dreading. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice breaking. He looked at me, his eyes filled with pain. "I don't know," he said, "but we need to be careful. If they find out the truth, it's over for both of us." I felt tears welling up in my eyes. "I'm scared, Alex," I whispered. He reached out and took my hand, his touch warm but shaky. "I know," he said. "I'm scared too, but we'll figure this out. Together." But deep down, I knew there was no way to fix this. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. The next few days were a nightmare. The school was buzzing with rumors, and I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me. I tried to act normal, to go about my day as if nothing was wrong, but it was impossible. Every time I walked into Alex's classroom, I felt like I was going to collapse. Then, one afternoon, the principal called me into her office. My heart was pounding as I sat down across from her, my hands clenched in my lap. "Emily," she said, her voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you some questions about Mr. Daniels." I felt my stomach drop. "What kind of questions?" I asked, my voice trembling. She leaned forward, her eyes searching mine. "There have been some concerns raised about his behavior," she said, "specifically his interactions with you. I need to know if there's anything you'd like to tell me." I felt like I was going to be sick. I wanted to tell her the truth, to confess everything, but I couldn't. I was too scared, too ashamed. So I lied. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's nothing." She looked at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded. "Okay," she said, "but if you ever feel uncomfortable or unsafe, I want you to know that you can come to me. Anytime." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. As I walked out of her office, I felt like I was going to collapse. The guilt was overwhelming, and I knew I couldn't keep this secret much longer. That night, I called Alex. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense. "Emily," he said, "what's wrong?" I took a deep breath, my hands trembling. "I can't do this anymore," I said, my voice breaking. "I can't keep lying. It's killing me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then he sighed, his voice heavy with regret. "I know," he said. "I can't either." We talked for hours that night, crying, apologizing, trying to make sense of the mess we had created. In the end, we both knew what we had to do. The next morning, I went to the principal's office and told her the truth. The fallout was immediate and devastating. Alex was fired, and the story made headlines. I was pulled out of school, and my parents were furious and heartbroken. The community was in shock, and I felt like I was drowning in shame and regret. But through it all, one thing became clear. I had to take responsibility for my actions. I had made mistakes, but I wasn't going to let them define me. I was going to learn from this, to grow, to become stronger. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I couldn't go on, when the weight of everything was too much to bear. But I kept going, one step at a time. And slowly, over time, I started to heal. As for Alex, I never saw him again. I heard through the grapevine that he moved away, started over somewhere new. I don't know if he ever found peace, but I hope he did. Despite everything, I don't hate him. I can't. He was a part of my story, a part of who I am, and in a strange way, I'm grateful for the lessons he taught me about love, about loss, and about the strength it takes to pick up the pieces and move on. This is my story. It's messy, it's painful, and it's far from perfect. But it's mine, and I'm learning to live with it.